Good morning, all. I am delighted to be here, and I want to start with a thank you. And the first thank you is because not only are you teachers, but you work in elementary schools. I'm biased, but that's when kids' lives are framed. That's when they become who they are. I would say that in any event, but in these times, the world's crazy, as you know. And for many of your kids, regardless of the family, regardless of the background, the faith that you bring them, the experiences you bring them, you're really a force that makes a difference in their life. So thank you for inviting me today. Thank you for what you're doing each and every day. In a minute, I'm going to start my PowerPoint, and I'm going to go through, and at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. And on the last slide, I've got my email address, my web page, and Laura also has it. And the reason why I say that is I'm going to go too quickly. I've got too much content. I wanted to cut stuff, and I thought I can't do that. So that's my long way of saying we're on the same team. I would love to hear from you later, whether it's next week, next month, next year. Marty was great in talking about the fact that this stuff isn't easy. You're going to feel like you're falling on your face. I still do, but we're all on the same team. So absolutely feel free to contact me. Okay, now I'm going to see if I can share my screen. So Laura, am I able to share my screen here?
You should be able to. You have co-hosting status.
Let me try this. Okay, multiple participants.
Let me double check on that. Yes, you are my co-host, so you should be able to.
All right, so somebody who's really good into technology. I'm down on share screen. There we go. All right.
Start. Sometimes, yeah, the start button is the tricky part.
So give me a nod if you can see my screen here.
I can see your screen, but I see the whole the side panel too. With
all right, good.
There you go. Now it's full screen.
So that's us. That's me. And I'm delighted to be here with you. And I'm going to start with a test. And if we were all together, I'd actually have you break in groups and talk about it. It's a quick question, though, and I'm just going to ask you to think and reflect. The question is, are there differences between success in school and success in life? Give you about 10 seconds. Okay, here's my bias. Absolutely, there are. What I find interesting is I go around, I do presentations all around the world, and when I ask that question, almost always, most of the educators agree, absolutely there are differences, we get it. But then I will say to them, okay, are those differences reflected in your curriculum? And there's a deadening silence. And the reality is in most schools, and I think it's less true in your schools because of your faith, but in most schools, tradition's still pretty traditional. We're doing the 3 R's, which we should do, but we're ignoring a whole lot else. And so the differences between success in life and success in school really aren't being looked at. So as I said, yes, there are. Here are some examples. I'll give you a second, let you just read that. So it's a very different world. We all live with that. I'm still blown away by the thought of swallowing a pill that can televise what's happening in my intestines. Here's another one. Last November, not even a year ago, Forbes magazine, they asked business people, what are the skills you need? Well, no surprise, tech savviness, data literacy, flexibility and adaptability, creativity, but here's number one. They want emotional intelligence. They want kids to be able to know themselves, know their strengths and weaknesses, work with other people. Scholastics are important, but they should be the floor, not the ceiling. Those photos of me, the top one I was in Dubai, the bottom one I was in the Philippines, and I have those there. I'm traveling around the world talking about this. Cultures are different, religions different, everything's different, but guess what? They feel the same need for social emotional learning that we do. When I present to those folks, they have the same concerns, the same worries. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation puts it best for students to be healthy and successful. I have Daniel Goleman's book there because I think it really changed the mindset about the importance of what we now call emotional intelligence. Another way to look at that I think helps you as teachers and as administrators, we all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, absolutely. And what I think we sometimes forget is when you look at that second level of safety, that's emotional safety too. If we want our kids to learn, if we want them to get to belonging, love, esteem, self-actualization, they need to feel safe. And that's not just physical safe from wild animals. It's being emotionally safe from people who are sitting across the hall from you, from your friends, from your family maybe. As Laura said, that's my book, The Formative Five. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through the Formative Five pretty quickly, and I'm going to talk about some ideas, suggestions, ways to implement them. And then I'm going to segue. In the second part of this, I'm actually going to talk about my new book, Taking Social Emotional Learning School-Wide, and I'll have some more specific ideas there. So what I want is when I'm finished, hopefully, one, you didn't fall asleep. Two, you got some good ideas. And three, you're ready to rock and roll with them with your kids. My bottom line, who you are is more important than what you know. You can see here's a photo of a teacher actually teaching empathy to her kids. We'll come back to that. And we'll also come back to who you are is more important than what you know. To me, that says it really well. And again, that's not to dismiss what you know. It's not to say the 3 R's aren't important. I'm a pain on knowing when you need to use a colon and a semicolon. It is to say, though, that our chief job is to create good people, the kind of people that you can count on, that you trust, people who have good values. And that's what this is about today. Another way to look at that, there's my Formative Five. To me, they all come together and they form human literacy. We talk a whole lot about literacy. Now I'm reading people talking about coding literacy. And to me, I want to say, hold on. Human literacy, who you are is more important than what you know. The images that you're going to see, the Formative Five, were done by high school kids in Arundel High, Maryland. I was out there giving a presentation, and their high school digital art teacher said, hey, could I have my kids make images of the Formative Five? I said, absolutely. So that's what you'll see. We'll begin here with empathy. I hope your screen's big enough. Here's this kid, Sarah Pick, a high schooler, and talk about taking empathy as standing in someone else's shoes. Look at the great image she's done. You know, how cool is that? Empathy has always been important. It is even more important, and I don't have to tell you more about this photo. I'm sure you see it. Back in the days before we stopped going to restaurants, my wife and I would go to restaurants and we would marvel at how often there'd be people sitting at a table near us, adults, kids, they're all at the table and everybody's looking at their phone. That's just the reality of the world. It's not good. It's our reality, and it works against empathy. Empathy is understanding, feeling with, not sympathy. And the first thing I want to say, and this is true for all the Formative Five, is that that Formative Five word needs to be part of the vocabulary. Kindergartners can know what empathy is. They're not going to know it with the sophistication of a kid who's 8 or 18, but they can still know what it means. And I think it helps if you talk about implementing empathy to consider that there are various levels. First is cognitive empathy, just knowing what the other person is feeling, understanding that people don't see things the way that you do. I think we do a pretty good job of that in schools generally. The second, though, is emotional empathy, and that's really knowing what the other person feels, not just understanding, but feeling, not just sympathy, but empathy. And I'll get to that on the next slide. But then here's a third one, and I think your schools, Lutheran schools, are particularly well positioned to work on this, and that's actionable empathy. That's doing. It's actually getting involved. It's working to help other people to make the world a bit different. So here are some examples. Top level cognitive empathy. This is something you can do with kids who are 6 and do it again if they're in high school. Have kids write down on a piece of paper their name, the names of their 3 best friends, and then ask them to write what everybody would want for a birthday present. Well, no surprise, if kids don't have much empathy, they think everybody wants what they want. Well, everybody doesn't. And then when you ask those other kids and begin to talk about it, It's a very easy way and powerful way to have younger children see that people who they like, people who are their friends, view things differently, have different needs. That's the knowing level of empathy. Second level down, true for all teachers, but particularly upper elementary, middle, and high school. And I think a mistake that sometimes we make is that in history and in literature, we talk about basically what happened, when it happened, how it happened. Too often we don't talk about why it happened. What were people feeling? Literature is great for getting into that. The book Wonder, the movie Wonder, which was so popular a few years ago, was really powerful there. Another way to look at emotional empathy is through the book Material World, and I've got that cover on the screen here. Material World is a book I think that you should have in your library. It is a book that looks at cultures around the world, 30 different cultures. And as maybe you can tell by the two photos, they have a photo of every family with all of their worldly possessions. And it is fascinating for kids in St. Louis to see what it's like if you're living not just in Los Angeles, but in Bali, if you're living in St. Petersburg, if you're living in Nairobi. What does that look like? And of course, the book also talks about climate, what they live, how they live, where they eat. But it's a great way to get into emotional empathy. And then the last is the social action efforts, actionable empathy doing. And down here you can see a photo. This is from my old school, New City School. We had a garden. Kids went and actually planted food, harvested it, donated to a homeless shelter. We did that for a few years, and then the teacher said to me, Tom, that's the knowing level. We need to get kids feeling. So what we did was we had the person who ran the homeless shelter come in and talk to us. And then that became actionable empathy as we got into not just harvesting, but making food packages and preparing them. Second one of the formative five, self-control. I'll give you a second look at those two images. Got marshmallows there. You probably know the marshmallow test. Walter Mischel, kids are 4 years old, gives them a marshmallow, leaves for 14 minutes, and they've been told, if I come back and you haven't eaten it, you get a second marshmallow. Well, sure enough, some kids eat the marshmallow and some don't. Tom Hoerr, me, I had the marshmallow down before we left the room. So I was a marshmallow eater, still am, okay? The only thing that would be better is if it was a marshmallow and chocolate, but that's a different subject. So in any event, some kids eat marshmallows, some don't. Interesting. What they do is they track these kids and they look at them through life. What they find is that 14 years later, there was a difference of 210 points on the SAT exam between kids who ate the marshmallows and kids who didn't. Well, that's a lot of points. That doesn't mean that eating marshmallows lowers your IQ, although probably too many marshmallows, but that's a different question. What it does mean is if at age 4 you didn't eat marshmallow, you probably at age 7 did your book report you were supposed to, and probably at age 17 you weren't on FaceTime until you did your schoolwork. So we know that that's easy, but then let me play it out a bit. Look what Michelle says, not just about SAT scores. So what that means, of course, is that if you didn't eat the marshmallow, it takes into other trajectories, not just academics. So you're sitting here, if you're like me and you're thinking, I'm in trouble, I ate the marshmallow. Well, hold on, all is not lost, because Michelle also says the ability to delay immediate gratification is an acquirable cognitive skill. That means we can all develop self-control. You can develop self-control with your kids. Again, you talk about it with them, not unlike empathy and vocabulary being worked. You talk about self-control, why it's important. And then I think you have kids set goals. And I talk about this more in my book. And again, shoot me an email. Love you to buy the book. You don't have to. I'm happy to answer your emails. I think with goals, it's important to have two kinds of goals. It's a scholastic goal and a personal one. The personal one at my old school might have been, I'm going to do better at recess at getting along with my friends. It might have been, I'm not going to interrupt in class. It might have been, I'm going to get to my homework fast or whatever. But you have both of those goals. And then I think a mistake we make is that we have a goal, we jump to the last column. Well, here's how I know I'm successful. What we don't talk about though with our kids, why is it going to be hard? Why is it going to be difficult? And I think that is really important. Too often, kids don't anticipate what the challenge is, and thus it's harder for them to plan how they're going to surmount that. My favorite story on that, years ago when I was at New City School, I had a teacher, and he and I were both trying to lose weight. And I said to him, hey, how about this? What if every Friday we meet after school and we'll talk about how we've done, we'll compare our weight. And he said, that's great. Let's meet at the Baskin Robbins by my house. And I'm like, hold on a second, let's back up here. That's a good example of not anticipating the obstacles. Then the third column, who are the collaborators? Who's going to help you? That's a way I think of advancing self-control. Third one is integrity. I'll let you read that definition. To me, integrity was one that I hadn't planned on. When I got into the Formative Five, I was going to do honesty, but the more I read, the more I thought, the more I believed it really is integrity. And that's the kind of thing in your Lutheran schools you do really well. And that is, you're not only teaching kids to be good people, you're teaching them to stand up for what's right. You're teaching them to make a difference. You're teaching them that their voice is important. Brene Brown puts it best, I think. And I think we teach integrity with kids by helping them understand the importance between honesty and integrity. They need to know that they need to be honest, absolutely. But they also know that their conscience is important and they need to stand up for what's right. Years and years ago, you may recall there was a big thrust in the United States against bullying. And there were all these programs to try to dissuade kids from engaging in bullying behavior, to reduce bullying in school. What they found was the most important technique, the most valuable one, was getting their peers to step in. When somebody's engaging in bullying behavior and April says, hold on, that's not right, that's far better than if the teacher does it. When Jen says, hold on, that's not the way you're supposed to be, that's really, really powerful. So again, as with empathy, as with self-control, kids need to know the word integrity. What does that mean? Why is it important? What can I be doing that reflects integrity? And if I back up to the literature and the history about which I talked when we were talking about empathy, who are the people who've made a difference in the world? Look at their integrity. Candidly, if you look at the people that we admire most, whether it's Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther, these are all people who took a stand. And it wasn't popular, but they took a stand because they felt it was right and they needed to follow their conscience. Embracing diversity. You may have noted that of the Formative Five, diversity is the only one that I have an adverb, embracing. And that's because when I was writing the book and I was talking with other people, everybody agreed, oh, absolutely, empathy, self-control, integrity, grit, which is the next one. Absolutely, those are important. We want those for our kids. But when I talked about diversity, there was more of a tepid response. People weren't ready to jump in. And I was like, hold on a second, folks, you don't get it. That's on our shoulders. You may be living in a community that is not diverse. The world is changing. Look at those numbers. So the world's becoming much more diverse. And if we want our kids to be successful, and again, however you define success, that's up to you. But if we want them to be successful, whether that's making money, being a good neighbor, being a good cross-country coach, whatever it is, then we need to help them learn how to respect, embrace other people. When I began talking about embracing diversity and doing presentations, I was struck by the fact that many of the folks in the audience, sometimes I talk to parents, sometimes I talk to educators, view diversity in racial terms, and I get that. Certainly in the United States, race is an issue that's in the newspapers often. When you look at people, you can typically tell what race they are, but that's only one of the diversities. This next slide shows the diversity of diversities. And most of those are apparent to you. You can make sense of what they are. There's two that I want to point out, though. If you look at the bottom, I've got a donkey and an elephant. And I probably don't need to tell you that political diversity is a real issue in our country today. And I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whatever you are. The point is, we as a culture need to do a better job of respecting people regardless of how they vote. Similarly, if you look at the top bell-shaped curve, I put that. I don't think this is an issue for your schools, but too often when I visit schools, there's a real hierarchy of intellect, and that's a diversity I think that we don't respect. Not every kid is going to read as well as the next person or calculate as well as the next person, but they have other strengths. My school, the New City School, was a multiple intelligence school, so that was a really easy way for us to look at other kids' strengths, and I'll talk about that a bit when I talk about place later on in the presentation. But I think when we look at all these diversities, it's a way of saying we need to teach children to embrace one another regardless of what they believe. Grit, absolutely. When I talk with educators, by and large, they say grit is really what our kids lack. And my shorthand for that is saying that we're in a trophy culture. Every kid who's on the team gets a trophy, whether or not she plays, whether the team wins. Kids are used to that. And parents, as you know, too often buoy their kids up. Years and years ago, a very popular term was helicopter parents, parents who got involved and protected their kids. Well, what I call it today are snowplow parents, parents who get in front and remove the barriers. And they love their kids. They think they're doing the right thing. But what they're doing is avoiding their children learning how to respond to failure and frustration. Here's Angela Duckworth. You've seen that, I know. Michael Jordan. Mia Hamm. So having grit, we can teach. And one of the ways I believe we teach that is by telling kids that mistakes can be good. Here's a photo of a mistake. These people are not graduates of New City School. But mistakes can be good. And why I say we need to do that, too often we make a mistake. And that is we think that all mistakes are bad. Well, all mistakes aren't equally bad. First of all, old mistakes are bad, absolutely. If you're making the same mistake over and over again, if you're not learning, that is not a good thing. However, and this is the important distinction, no mistakes are not good either. Too often, we continue to do the same thing because it works well. We've got a formula, we've got a practice, and we're going to do it. Well, guess what? Even if we're being successful, the world around us is changing. And what we're doing isn't going to always be successful. More than that, we're not learning. It's painful, folks, but you know, we don't learn from our successes, we learn from our failures. And by making no mistakes, we're not really growing. What we need to do, there it is make new mistakes. Make new mistakes. Later, I've got a slide where I show the t-shirts that I had at New City School. And we would have a new t-shirt every year. I'd surprise the staff, and it was kind of the thrust of the year. And one year I had a t-shirt that said good failures. And people were like, what do you mean good failures? We're a school. You can't have kids failing. And I said, hold on, I don't agree. When we talk about grit, and I was interviewed on NPR years ago, and the comment I made that caught everybody's attention was that schools are the place where children can learn how to respond to failure and frustration. Everybody's going to fail. Everybody's going to be frustrated. But if our kids have never experienced that, and in a lot of your schools, you've got high flyers. You've got kids who always do well. They've never experienced it, and they get out in the real world, whether they're 18, 20, 38, and they hit the wall, they're not going to know what to do. And so to me, we need to have them experience good failures. And a good failure is one from which a kid learns. And so I would talk about that. And I would talk about that with my kids. And when they don't do well, I would say, okay, what did you learn? What are you going to do differently? That makes it a good failure. By the way, parenthetically, uh, as Laura said when she introduced me, I led schools for lots of years. And when I got into this, there would be teachers, and I would say to them, "Hey, I'm going to come observe you next Tuesday." And this would be a teacher who was really strong and wasn't anxious. And I'd say, "And I want to see a lesson that doesn't work well." And they go, "What?" And I said, "I know you're a good teacher, you've got it down, but I want you to try something differently. Come in, do something that flops, it's great, and I'm going to say to you what happened, what can we learn?" And that's me modeling supporting good failures. So on the left, again, here's my book, The Formative Five. You saw that we talked about self-control, integrity, embracing diversity, grit through school culture. And down on the bottom now, you're going to see these are the pieces of culture that I talk about. In my new book, the one on the right, I use culture as the model. And as Laura said, I was at St. John's giving a presentation. Jen Holzhauser and Stephanie Bowman were there. They came up to me afterwards and said, "We're using the Formative Five," and they gave me some great ways that they were using the Formative Five to teach children about the life of Christ. And I've got that in the book, and I thought, how cool is that? So what I'm now going to do, hopefully for about 20 minutes, because I want to give us some time at the end, is I'm going to go through the components of culture. And I'm going to talk about how culture can be used to implement the Formative Five. And the reason why I do that, if I was in the room with you, I'd stop and ask the question. Often when I give this presentation in person, I'll stop at the end and I'll say, "What are you thinking?" Everybody loves the idea that who you are is more important than what you know. They understand the importance of social emotional learning. And I'll say, "What's the problem?" The problem almost always is we don't have enough time. And as you all know better than I do, we administrators do a great job of adding things to your plate. We don't do a very good job of taking things off your plate. Teachers have too much to do, not enough time to do it. That was pre-COVID. Now it's even more. Every teacher that I know is working longer and harder. So the question is, okay, Tom, we really support social emotional learning. We believe it. How can we implement it when we don't have enough time as it is? And what I'm going to do now is show you how school culture can be framed in a way that I think helps you teach, reinforce social emotional learning, the Formative Five. The first one is vision, values, and mission. Your schools each have vision, they've each got mission. Because you're wonderful Lutheran schools, they're going to have references to becoming better people, to Christ, to religion, and that's really great. You're different than a lot of schools, though, and you'll see this on the next slide. Bacona and Davidson talk about character as having two components. They talk about performance character and moral character. Take a second and just read the performance character terms. Those are all important, absolutely. And yet, too often when we look at mission statements, that's all that we see. We talk about those kinds of things. We talk about kids achieving their potential. My argument, who you are is more important than what you know, is that moral character is important too. Respect, responsibility, caring, contributing, ethical, compassion, basically being a good person, being the kind of a student that we embrace because you're going to make a difference in the world. And so the first thing I think is looking at your mission statement. One of the best faculty meetings that we had at New City School, people came in, I gave everybody a 3x5 card. I put our mission statement up on the screen, and I said, I had some words highlighted, words that were talking about what we wanted our kids to be. And I said, write down what you're doing to help these kids become what our visions and our missions say. Well, it was a great faculty meeting. At New City School, in our mission statement, we have the word joyful learning, the term joyful learning. We want our kids to experience fun and learning. And it was amazing having the dialogue. So to me, when you talk about social emotional learning, Formative Five, begin by looking at your mission statement. It should be posted in your school, in the office, in the hall, maybe even in your room. And the question is, what are you doing to work on it? Not just with the performance character, but with the moral character. Second thing is practices. That's part of school culture. And here I talk about Roland Barthes' collegiality. Barth says basically, that's his book. He says basically, if students are to grow and learn, the adults must grow and learn too. And that makes all the sense in the world. The metaphor that he uses is when you're on a plane. Remember those days when we used to fly on planes? He says when you're on a plane and they give you the directions about the oxygen mask, they say, if you're holding an infant and the mask comes down, take care of yourself first. Well, you have to do that because you've got to take care of yourself if you're going to take care of that infant. Well, likewise, if we want children to grow and learn, we, the adults, must be growing and learning too. And we can't assume that's just going to happen. I would argue that not just principals, not just administrators, but teachers need to consciously pursue collegiality. Barth has 4 components of collegiality. I added a 5th one. So he's talking about teachers talking about students, developing curriculum, observing one another, teaching one another, teachers and administrators learning together. I think it would be great if every school had not just a book club, but an article club. People who voluntarily agree to meet and talk about an article. If you want to do that, you don't want to read a book, you send me an email. I wrote an article in Education Week about a year and a half ago on human literacy. It's 1 page. It winds up talking about the Formative Five. But basically, the premise is who you are is more important than what you know. Again, 1 page, 1,000 words. If you send me an email, I'll send you the link to that article, and then you and some colleagues can get together and talk about that. Do you agree, disagree? What did I miss? How can you enact that in your school? So collegiality is a practice, I think, that is really important. In a good school, everyone grows. Again, how to develop collegiality. I'll take a second and let you look at that. Sometimes people confuse the words congeniality with collegiality because they sound alike, and there's some similarity. Congeniality is the basis. That's just getting along. That needs to be in a school. You know, when I walk in on Monday morning, I want people saying to me, hey, how was your weekend? Can you believe the Cardinals lost all those games? How's your dog doing? I want to say to them, hey, Jen, how's your cross country team doing? I want to ask what's happening. But that's only the basis. If you only have a congenial setting, you're not going to learn, you're not going to grow as much as if you have a collegial setting. And that's where you build by having people work and learning together. The congenial setting, one of the things I did at my school is I found a parent who was an art teacher, hired her to come in, and we did a voluntary after-school clay class. Any of the teachers who wanted to come, any of the staff, it was great. About 1/3 of the staff did. She taught us. I made this goofy looking pot. But while we were sitting there working, we were talking. After that was over, because we were multiple intelligence at school, somebody said, hey, we should do a different intelligence. So they had a kickboxing class. I was not part of that. I was part of the juggling class, which was humbling because I can't juggle. Basically, it was a way of bringing the faculty together to be congenial so we could be collegial. This is another example of a practice. This is 4th grade at New City School. And from the photo, you would say, hey, these kids are studying Greek history and culture. They're building Greek temples, using construction paper, staples, glue. They are. But that's really not what they're doing. That's not all they're doing. What they're really doing is studying how to be a team. So let me come back. This is a good example of teaching social emotional learning. In your classroom, you may do something like having your kids work as a team to build something, to perform in a play or whatever. Well, before these teachers did it, what they did is they talked with kids about what it means to be a good team member. What does it mean to be on a team? What does a good team member do? Then the kids developed a rubric. Let me let you look at that. Hopefully your screen, you can see that. This was developed by 4th graders, a rubric for teamwork. And you can see on the left, and again, if you send me an email, I'll send you this if you need it, although the best thing would be to do it with your kids. But you can see on the left, They're the various components they identified. And then the kids came up with, this is what it looks like. So when they were building this, it was a 3-day project. They talked about teamwork before day one. At the end of day one, each kid rated himself, herself on how they were as a teammate. On day two, they then rated the team. And then on day three, the teacher led a discussion when they, as a team, talked about how well they had done. People, got to focus on the positive. Relationships are key. Got to focus on the positive. All right, now, what I'm going to tell you on the next slide is the most important thing you're going to hear today. Apology to Marty and everybody else who preceded me, because it's something that is important in your life, not just in your school. One of the things we know is that to develop and maintain a good relationship, whether it's with your students, with your significant other, with your family, with your friends, is you need to have a 5-to-1 positive to negative relationship. What that means is you need to invest with 5 positives for every negative, okay? I got to tell you, that's hard to do. I talked about that with my faculty. I talked about it with them with kids. They got that. And then I said to them, hey, I'm going to do it with you too. Great. But the one's more complicated because it's not just 5 positives to every negative. It is 5 compliments, if you will, to any one of these. So it's not just a criticism. It's maybe when I didn't say something that you were hoping I would say. Maybe it's a neutral statement. I walk in Jen Picken's classroom and there's some really cool things happening and I'm in a hurry and I say, would you do this? And I leave and I didn't say to her, wow, it was great to see how engaged those kids were. Or maybe I say, why are the kids so noisy? I didn't mean that as an insult, but where did it register? Bingo. So now let me give you the pragmatic piece of this. 5-to-1 is your goal. I got to tell you, I worked on this for years. I never got to 5-to-1. But maybe because I worked on it, I got from my 1.1 to 1.9 or to 2.4. That is something in what I would like you to do. Here's your assignment. I would like you tonight for homework to talk about the 5-to-1 with your significant other, with your family, with whom you want, with somebody else. And you can say to them, hey, I heard this terribly charismatic speaker this morning. And then after him, I heard from Tom Hoerr. And Tom Hoerr talked about 5-to-1. What do you think of that? Does that make sense? Do we do that? Because it has to be conscious. When I talked about it with my faculty, again, I talked about it with them doing it with the kids. And I said, but we need to do it. And I'm going to share it with you because I'm going to do the 5-to-1 to you. And they all kind of rolled their eyes. And I said, and I went back. And it was really fun because over the course of the year, I'd see a teacher and she might come to me and say, you know, Tom, things are good, but where are we on the 5-to-1? I haven't heard anything positive from you lately. I'd say, oh, April, I'm glad you said that. Thank you. And then I'd make a point of it. And the 5-to-1 doesn't mean, Brandy, I like your sweater. Brandy, your desk is nice. It means that you're giving people compliments that are meaningful to them. And in schools, you're talking about not just their pedagogy, you're talking about their relationships with kids. You're talking about their colleagues. So that 5-to-1, I think, is the most important piece you'll get today, even if you don't buy social emotional learning, even if you don't believe in the Formative 5, trust me, if you work on that 5-to-1, you're going to find the relationships around you, all of them, being better. I think we directly need to teach emotions. This is a photo you can see that I took from a classroom. They're teaching kids here, these were second graders, what the emotions are. And let me give you this one. This one works regardless of your age, of your student's age. So this is New City School, first grade. And what they did is they had finished teaching Peter Pan. They were talking about emotions. So they had 4 little, if you will, sheets where kids stick their heads through. They got the directions, and then the kids went to corners of the room. So each one of these kids is facing 1/4 of the class. The kid gets a 3x5 card that he looks at, she looks at, and the card has an emotion. It might say happy, angry, mad, sad, sleepy, surprised, whatever. And that kid then has to show the emotion using only his or her face, while the children in the audience have to guess it. It's a great way to consciously teach kids, again, part of empathy, how to read other people's emotions. The teacher said it was amazing. First of all, they said some of the kids in the audience picked up on it right away. Other kids weren't able to discern when somebody was angry versus when they were disappointed. They couldn't read their faces. Also, some of the kids, they said, regardless of what the card said, continued to give the same facial expression. Well, we would not say, gosh, all my kids come in at different reading readiness levels. That's just the way life is. Some are going to be good readers, some aren't. We would say, hold on, we're going to work on these kids to help them become better readers. Well, likewise, some of these kids are really strong with their empathy, with their ability to read other people. Others aren't. And we use this as a tool to work on it. You could use that with all age kids. It's a fun activity, and it's a way of saying reading other people's emotions, understanding them is an important part of empathy. Narrative is another one of the culture pieces, and I'll let you read there. Narrative is not just words. You'll see that in a second. But look at the stories. If you're a classroom teacher, let me give you another way to look at that. I would suggest that the last 5 minutes of your day, whatever you're doing, before you dismiss, you say to the kids, hey, what did we learn today? What are we going to talk about? When your parents ask you what happened at school today, what are you going to be able to say to them? What we're doing there is we're framing the narrative. We're having it presented in a way that is meaningful. Narrative strategies in your school. What are the traditions? This is a photo from New City School. These people are getting longevity pins. We did that at the school picnic. At the bottom, 2 bullets. One of the things that I've begun doing, I didn't do it when I was at New City, I wish I had, was calling faculty meetings learning meetings, because learning meetings should describe what's going on. I also wrote an article in 2009. If you send me an email, I'll send you the link. What if faculty meetings were voluntary? And of course, the point there is that the voluntary, nobody'd come. Well, what could we do to make those meetings that people wanted to come? Too often, I think, and I'm guilty of this, I didn't take into consideration people need food, people need comfortable setting, people need to be motivated. So when you talk about narrative in a school, that applies, I think, to all of us. If you're in charge of a committee, what can you do so that everybody wants to come to that committee? I talked about narrative not just being words. This is from the hall at New City School. As I said, every year I would surprise the faculty with a t-shirt, and it would have kind of the school theme, if you will. And you can see down here, Got Grit is one of them. Right above that, So Many Ways to Be Smart. That reflects the multiple intelligences, which were listed on the back of the shirt. Up a little more, you can see diversity is a piece. And again, it was a way of saying, what's the theme, what's the message, what's the narrative, what do we want to control? Place is important, and I think too often we overlook that, we forget that. Place affects what we feel and what we do. And that's New City School. And I think a mistake sometimes we make, and I'm talking to principals about walls and halls, talking to teachers about classrooms, walls and halls, I'm talking to everybody. Too often we stop at safety. We stop at welcome. We don't talk about who are the students who are on the wall. So let me tell you, Laura mentioned that I'm a scholar in residence at the University of Missouri St. Louis. What I'm doing is teaching in the Ed Leadership Program. So if you're somebody who is going to be a principal, I'm probably going to be teaching one of your classes. And I go out and I visit schools. I visit these students. They're working on a master's or a doctorate, maybe a specialist. I visit them in the schools. So I've been going to 20 schools a year, probably, mostly public, some private, some religious. And the good news is, when I walk in schools, almost all of them have lots of kids' stuff on the wall, artwork, papers. That's the good news. Semicolon, however, comma, the bad news is that work only represents the top 20% of the kids. Too often there are kids who never make it to the walls because their work isn't valued. We don't look at things like trajectory and effort. So let me show you some examples of things you can do. This is from Village of Shane, in fact, in West St. Louis County. And you can see what they've done is taken the goals from their mission statement and they photograph their students, their girls, enacting those mission statements. And they change those. So every year, a different senior is featured in the photos. That could happen at your school as a way to go back. Remember, number one was vision and mission. You could tie that in. Having discussions about what's there, who's there would be really powerful. Here's another way. This is from a school in New Hampshire. Empathy was really important there. They adopted the Formative Five, and that bulletin board shows really pretty clearly that it's putting yourself in other people's shoes. That's a nice way of using the bulletin board to reinforce values, to reinforce the Formative Five. This is from New City School. The photo on the right is what you see. The one on the left is to give you an idea of the size. Diversity was a big piece of who we were. That bulletin board's probably 20 years old. It has Franklin Roosevelt, Gandhi, Braille, all kinds of people, Helen Keller, and it's a way of saying diversity is important. That was us using the walls as a way to educate. This one I have to put in there. Student restrooms. I have not been to your schools. In most schools, the restrooms don't reflect our values. You can see I wrote an article about that. I was the Principal Connection columnist for 14 years. I wrote about it. In most schools, the restrooms aren't something that we're proud of, and that's because nobody's in charge of the restroom. Custodian is, but that's it. If I walk in your classrooms, I guarantee there's stuff up that looks great. It's not true of the restrooms, and I'm saying that's a missed opportunity. What does that say to the kids? So the middle photo is from New City School. We talked about that. That's our boys' second floor restroom, and you can see there's art in there. The two stalls are from a high school in St. Louis, and what they did was talked about it, and again, decorated it in what I've heard from all the schools that have done this is when you take some time and invest it in the restroom, the kids feel some ownership. The kids should have a say in what's going to go there, what does it look like, and behavior becomes a whole lot better. This was outside the first floor at New City School. Look at that, and you can guess what happened. We had a restroom first floor, and the boys and girls were not behaving the way they should in the restroom. We did all kinds of things to improve restroom behavior. I even had what I thought was a great idea. I had our custodian come in and talk about how hard it was to clean up after they had been throwing toilet paper or whatever. Didn't work. Then the teachers, always smarter than I was, said, why don't we have the kids sign a pledge? So we had a compact. The kids generated it, they wrote it, they put it on the restroom door, and guess what? All of a sudden, behavior improved. And I use that as another example to reinforce your values. This is my favorite slide. I'll let you look at it. Now, what's powerful about that, those aren't the best attendance kids. All we know is that Nisha, the #1 student, she increased her attendance by 8%. My guess is it wasn't 88 to 96. It probably wasn't 80 to 88. It could have been 50 to 58, who knows? But what this principal did, Casey Seals, she wanted to reinforce progress, trajectory, effort. Now, if you go in that hall, that's a Central Visual and Performing Arts High School, Kings Highway and Arsenal. If you go into that, there's tons of stuff where kids are excelling. There's the honor roll list, there's great art, but this is also there. I had a student in my UMSL class a few years ago, and she was really into grit. We talked about this, and I visited her school. It was the St. Louis Public School, elementary school. And again, there were all kinds of things about kids who achieved, but there wasn't anything to track trajectory and show what kids were learning and the progress they were making. That is something I think that could be in any kind of school. And the best part about it, if you go back to the collegiality, would be having you and your faculty, your colleagues sitting down and talking about what might that look like? How can we acknowledge the kids who are busting their tail? They're getting a C+. They may never make it on the honor roll. How can we honor those kids? Formative Five general strategies. Makes sense. We've talked about that. This is important. If you come away and you're really buzzed, don't jump into all five. If you said to me, Tom, we're going to spend the month of September on empathy, I'd say, great. If you said we're going to spend the whole year on just empathy, I'd say, wonderful. If you say to me, we're going to do all five by Thanksgiving, I'm saying that's a mistake. So prioritize, focus, go in depth. Vocabulary is key. Engage faculty members. In a school that really embraces social emotional learning meetings, faculty meetings, professional development helps teachers, administrators gain in their social emotional learning too. Most of the things that in my book I suggest we do with kids, I think we also do with staff members. And then we've got to get parents engaged as well. That's my last slide, my two dogs who have been nicely quiet by me. My email address again, Laura has that. We've got about 5 more minutes, and hopefully we'll stop sharing. And Laura, I'm going to turn it to you to ask some questions or however you want to move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And Tom, so as I'm listening and thinking too, so last year we, for our professional learning as a group, we focused on school culture. Gary Brooks present to us, and we learned a lot of things, and just this continues to support that message. And I know through the pandemic this spring, one of the biggest lessons learned, I think for our Lutheran schools in particular, and how they handled things, is that it was all about the relationships for them, and having concern for that social emotional aspect of things. And I think, do we have someone else's? Maybe Maureen, if you could turn off whoever is screen sharing right now, that would be great. And also one of the things we learned this morning from Marty, he talked about things that bring joy and how we can have joy, and you reinforced that by talking about joyful learning, and also how the social emotional learning and academics, they're not two separate things, but they dovetail together. And one of the things we talked about this morning too is that how like reminding students that they are not their grades, and there's just it's such a bigger thing. And if we all help students pay attention to all these other types of things, the soft skills, these social emotional things, how much better off our society will be in the future. So I wanted to just back up for just 1 second. We are getting some things in the chat. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. I'll come back to those later. But so we have just a few minutes left. In particular, so this world has, since we've been out of school, and then we're coming back. And Tom, you and I talked about this earlier this summer, the diversity part. What are some ideas for teachers on how they can, and not only racial diversity, but what are some maybe steps that they can take in their classroom to help their students embrace diversity in their classrooms?
Well, Lauren, I think you're right. Racial diversity is key, but it can also be polarizing if we begin there. And what I would do, regardless of the age of the kids, I would talk about diversity. I think they need to know it's valuable, and I would generate the different kinds of diversities after. I think it would be interesting to give kids, and you all can figure this out, to give kids a questionnaire where they write down 20 things about them. And then I would do great Venn diagrams, because from those 20 things, you would give areas where they're similar. Religion would be one where your group is similar. But there would be other things like family structure, what they like for dessert. And you could do lots of Venn diagrams and get at the diversity that we all have. And what it says to us is that while we're diverse in lots of different ways, the bottom line is we're all God's people. We're all the same. And children need to learn that. They need to hear that. And I think it would be interesting then, and one of the things in a longer presentation, often what we did at New City was we would give kids homework assignments. The homework assignment being they would go home and they would interview parents. So it might be interesting to have children interview their parents, or maybe you could even make it, they could call a grandparent on the phone or whatever, and ask them about diversity. What was it like when they grew up? What was it socioeconomically? And you'd use a different word. Was the income the same? Was the race the same? What do they remember? And what children need to understand is that they grew up in a very small universe, and it's a much bigger world. So I think beginning by looking at our schools, our classroom, at the diversity, where it's diverse, and then burgeoning out, I think is really a good thing. In terms of curriculum, and I think you probably are already on that, making a point of reading about people who aren't simply like we are, I think benefits everyone.
Okay, great. Thanks for that advice. And I will mention in both of Tom's books, they're very I don't know if user friendly is the right thing, but there are little like quizzes or surveys or self-assessment type tools that might be a great faculty read or self-study in these areas. So.
And Laura, let me just add, when you say user friendly, you know, I write books now these days.
We see.
Well, two things. One is I'm not as good as I write. I sound much better than I really was. But the other is you guys are the experts. Anything that I offer in my book, you're going to do better if you take it at your school and you develop it with your colleagues. You're the brain trust. So if I can inspire and get you started, that's great. But the real power comes from what you do with your kids, with the people across the hall, and with the people in your building.
Great. All right. Great message. Thanks, Tom, for being with us today. So for everyone, this concludes our professional learning for today. Thank you for hanging in there with us through some of the technical glitches that we had earlier today. I will be sending out the survey that I mentioned earlier. If you're hearing amongst your colleagues, I don't know what was happening with why some people were not getting emails. This one will be coming from my email address, not the Zoom registration. So maybe that's one thing that helped. If I have all your correct email addresses, like I said, sometimes we're getting some typos. Like I said, the survey link, the certificate link is at the end of your survey. The survey will be open, I'll leave it open for 2 weeks to give you time. I know you're heading out for a much deserved holiday weekend, and I wish you God's blessings and peace during this weekend. Find some time to enjoy your family and friends, relax, unwind, and I hope you find just a little bit of refreshment before heading into the next week. So, bye everyone, take care.